I would like to welcome everyone back to this second session of the European Green Infrastructure Day of 2023. I have here some of the panelists. First, I'd like to present myself very shortly. I am moderating this second session today. Very honored to do this. I am a senior officer for nature-based solutions and biodiversity at ICLEI Europe. And yes, Bettina turned her camera on. We have with us today Bettina. She's the head of unit of Natural Capital and Ecosystems Health, DG Environment. We also have Ollie, Ojala, a senior ministerial advisor for the Ministry of Environment of Finland. We're also going to have Jutta Paulus from Greens Germany. She's a shadow rapporteur of the nature restoration law, and she's going to join us a little bit later today, like more or less in half an hour, whereas the session is running. We also have here Florian Becker. He's the project coordinator of the Green City Accord at Eurocities. And we're also going to have today here with us Toni Amich. He's a green roof specialist for Sempergreen from Spain. Yes, so with this, I would like to give the word to Bettina and say hi. Bettina, we're going to start with you.
Excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect. So thank you very much for your kind introduction. As you heard, I work for the European Commission, and the topic that we are discussing today is extremely high on our agendas at the moment. So really happy for this timely exchange. As you know, the nature restoration law, which you have already mentioned, Daniela, is sort of the outcome and the consequence of a bigger structure. So not only do we have the European Green Deal, but we also have, as announced in the Green Deal, the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And in this strategy, we have recognized the importance of addressing the quality of urban ecosystems also. They are actually havens for wildlife, even though you may not expect that at first glance, but for pollinators and birds, cities and their green spaces really provide very important havens. Cities also have many problems that they face because of climate change. So we have heat waves, we have excessive flooding, including, of course, stormwater overflows. We have droughts, and so green spaces in our cities and urban areas help to regulate this, to contribute to adaptation to climate change. And they have also very concrete functions, these green spaces, for our own health as citizens and people living in these cities, for example, air quality, and also water retention and so on. So it is very important to keep our cities as livable and as green as possible. And this is why the biodiversity strategy has set out to improve the situation. We have a very important decline of green spaces in our cities that we have observed over the last decades. And the biodiversity strategy reminds us that we must halt this decline and do whatever we can to improve the situation. So like for other targets of the EU biodiversity strategy, the Commission's proposal for a nature restoration law is setting also targets for urban green spaces in order to halt the loss of biodiversity in our urban spaces and to improve the situation, as I already mentioned. The nature restoration law and its targets builds on existing frameworks, legislation, policies, and so on. And in the same way, the urban part of this proposal is linked not only to all the other ecosystems that are addressed in the proposal, but also to some other initiatives that are out there, most of them under the European Green Deal. To mention just one, the Commission has just come forward with a new deal for pollinators. This is our revised strategy for pollinators, and pollinators actually find very important spaces also in our urban areas. Interestingly, the biodiversity strategy and the nature restoration law proposal have set this on path for Europe. But now, since December, we also have the global biodiversity framework. And in there, we equally have a target on urban greening. So like for all the other global targets, the nature restoration law will also be our vehicle in the EU to enable our member states and ourselves as a whole community to reach these global targets that our member states have committed themselves to in Montreal in a very cold setting at the end of last year, where heat waves in our cities were probably thought quite far away. But just to share this with you, I heard on the news this morning that yesterday and today temperatures of up to 40 degrees are expected in some cities in the south of Spain, Murcia, Sevilla, and so on. So it is very clear that the people who are living in these cities, if they have a chance to be in a green space and to get a bit of cooling, they will go for that. And I think every citizen in Europe has maybe not a right, but should benefit from such better quality of life in the cities where they live. So the nature restoration law, as I mentioned, aims to halt the loss of biodiversity in urban systems. It also aims to improve, notably by increasing the green space in cities and by increasing specifically what we call tree canopy cover. Green space in cities, and this is the next very important point, is not necessarily only the parks and other green areas. It is also what we can see behind Toni actually on his background. It is the idea of including green in our built environment. So I know we have specialists on this panel who know much more about green roofs and green walls and all the other options that exist, not only to create these effects and these services that nature can deliver for us also in our cities, but also to really improve to the quality of the built environment. Because if we integrate, for example, rainwater into our water cycles that go into buildings, then we are doing something for energy and water efficiency at the same time. So lots of benefits to be found from urban greening. Maybe to mention also that, of course, this negotiation on the Commission's proposal is now ongoing, and I'm sure that our parliamentarian, Ms. Paulus, will maybe tell us some more about that. But it is also clear that this target on urban greening has raised some questions and comments and also concerns from some member states who feel that they may already have a lot of green space, which is of course excellent, and B, that this may limit in some way the ability of cities and regions to do their town and area planning. And now this is not at all the intention of this proposal. This proposal really aims to improve, to keep what we have and to improve it. But in the particular case of cities, the proposal doesn't say you need to keep your parks where they are. It just means you need to keep green in the city. But this doesn't prevent you from further developing your city. What it wants us to do is, when we further develop our cities, to do it greener, as I mentioned, either by renovating existing infrastructure and buildings to integrate these green elements, or by constructing from scratch, but in a way where there's a lot of green elements integrated. Also, a few more trees to line our streets would really be pleasant everywhere. So there is plenty of opportunities that do not prevent further town planning. We know that in several member states in the EU, there is an urgent need for more housing, and those citizens should also benefit then from the best possible quality of life that they can have. So maybe to end on two more points. One is that I was mentioning water efficiency and energy efficiency. There are also very clever ways of combining green roofs, for example, with energy production, because I have learned recently that actually solar panels work extremely well on green roofs, because, as I was told, then the cooling capacities of this green roof also help to cool the system that runs the solar panels. So many win-win possibilities in urban greening to be found. And a final word, there are plenty of opportunities also from EU funds to help our cities, regions, and member states fund such greener options for city. There is, of course, the regional funds that are specifically also for urban development. There's also the Horizon Europe program, and in particular, there are two missions on the horizon that I would like to mention. One is the mission on cities, that's an obvious one, but there's also the mission on adaptation. And as part of the mission on adaptation, there's also the aim to make, I think, 100 cities more capable of dealing with climate adaptation. And this is especially and particularly what we're trying to discuss today. So happy to have been able to give you these first thoughts, and really looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bettina. I think this was really, really interesting to hear. And I mean, the new restoration law, the nature restoration law is, yeah, very, very important. Not only for us working in the field of nature-based solutions and climate adaptation, but also I think for many people that don't know yet how important it is, like for the citizens themselves. Maybe they're not tuned in knowing that this nature restoration law exists, but for sure they will, they will really notice the effects of this law when it really starts rolling and the city starts really protecting more and more green areas and maybe making space for new ones. Yes, I have some questions here for you. I think you touched upon most of them, and maybe only one before we go to the next panelist that I would like to ask you. You mentioned a little bit the funding lines, right, for this, to make this possible. So you mentioned Horizon Europe, that is doing a lot of research in the field. You mentioned also some regional funds. I was just wondering, are there any other ways that, for example, you can engage the wider public into, I don't know, is the Commission foreseeing something related to crowdsourcing, or I don't know, investment from investors for greening, like a little bit more creative part that is not the usual funding lines that we have. Just to talk a little bit about that, if we can bring new actors into the investment arena, and that we don't only relate in public, but the public hand, and maybe the private sector can jump in as well.
Thank you so much. Very happy that you mentioned this, because from the Commission, we of course always asked first how much money could the EU funds make available. So this is indeed what I have mentioned. Also because, as you mentioned, the general awareness of the existence of these funds is maybe not yet ideal. So a lot of the potential from the EU funds are not reaped yet by our member states, regions, and cities. This is not only true for urban greening, but for generally biodiversity funding, because a lot is available already and unfortunately not necessarily programmed everywhere and always to the best capacity. But I think you make a very important point, because EU funds and public funds can only get us so far. They can be very good catalysts to bring together actors, but the real big funding challenge is to get more private investments. And here, urban greening, I think, is potentially in a better situation than some other parts of biodiversity funding, because we are here talking about new technological and smart solutions. There's a lot of research involved, but there is also a market, because we are talking about housing and infrastructure and so on. So while we are trying to make possible services produced by nature in the built environment, there is also a clear business element that is probably more tangible than when we talk about restoring our rivers or our other habitats, where the benefits are huge, but the returns on investment, we are often told, are not short-term and not so clearly to be found. So I think in urban greening, we have a really big playground where we can make a lot of progress. And we have actually also from the Commission side come forward with some guidelines on urban greening and how member states can produce these urban greening plans that I haven't yet mentioned, that are suggested in the biodiversity strategy that our cities and towns should set up for themselves, because it will help them in this big project. And of course, bringing it back to the nature restoration law, these plans can then be integrated fully into the future national restoration plans, because it's very clear that measures taken in cities are crucial for biodiversity and our ecosystems at large.
Thanks so much for this, Bettina. Yes, I guess we can hear a bit from Ollie. Ollie might bring us another perspective, and we want to have a good discussion here today. So Ollie, so he's working for advising the Ministry of Environment of Finland, and he's a senior in his position, and he would also tell us a little bit about the Finnish position here and how they see the new restoration law.
Okay, good. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present the Northern European view to restoration. Like Daniela told, I'm a senior ministerial advisor in the Ministry of Environment in Finland, and I'm in charge of EU biodiversity policy. And lately, I've been very much engaged with the EU nature restoration law. And there, the rest of these few lines I'm going to say relate to partly how we see the EU nature restoration law, but definitely it's a misunderstanding if and when we have been seen as negative towards the Article 6 of the EU nature restoration law. We are very much analyzing the details and implementability of the article, and therefore we've been quite active in this article. But our general view is very positive. And before I go to those, I can't help mentioning that I'm calling from Lahti. That was the 2021 Green Capital of the Europe. And this year was a great chance for me and other citizens of Lahti to have a look at the different types of activities a municipality can do for sustainability. And now to the 3 points I have. First of all, urban environments are important and must be a part of every future biodiversity strategy and action plan, just like it is an important part of the EU nature restoration law. So I have 3 points, and first one is that when and as we want to restore ecosystems, there's absolutely no way to justify leaving urban ecosystems out, especially as these are the environments where the humans have most profound impact on natural ecosystems. The second point is relatively ecological based, namely substituting the loss of biodiversity in rich agroecosystems is very much possible in urban environments. There are many threatened biotopes, habitat types in agroecosystems that haven't been helped by the common agricultural policy, and there's plenty of room for actions in urban environments to help, especially those habitats and species dependent on those habitat types that are threatened in their original environment. And then the third interesting option, third interesting point is that the urban environments are the places where the population mostly gets into contact with nature, or does not if the city they live in does not allow it. And from the point of view of root causes or indirect drivers of biodiversity loss, it is absolutely important that the inhabitants get into contact with nature. This builds their personal relationship with nature and builds their motivation to conserve and restore nature. And there's an interesting theory that getting contact with nature with your different senses helps building empathy towards other species and keeps the motivation up. In urban environments, it's also possible to engage inhabitants to bigger and smaller actions in huge numbers, so that it builds hope, maintains hope and motivation to act for nature. So these all actually are linked to the IPBES global assessment from 2019 that said halting biodiversity loss is possible, but on top of the traditional nature conservation measures, we need to tackle also the root causes or indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. This means basically the values and behaviors of people, and by getting also the city dwellers into contact with the nature, we can influence their values, their behaviors, and hopefully, and I believe we can change this to better and support the halting of biodiversity loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie, so much for making this very positive intervention here, and also saying that we need really more than just conservation measures and methodologies. We really need to get the buy-in of the resident. So my question here to you goes in this sense, actually, like in terms of gaining, the awareness and the buy-in from residents, from cities. Can you comment a little bit more? Do you know any example maybe in Finland in that sense, in the Finnish experience, and getting more participation, more engagement? And of course, just reacting a bit to the questions and answers that I was reading now, we're not talking only about green roofs and green walls, and as Bettina said, also not only about parks. I mean, I use a lot the term nature-based solutions, but we are talking about nature in cities. So it's very broadly understood, and it has a really wide range. The types of natural features that we're talking about in the session. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And what I was saying was not actually even referring that much to green roofs and green walls, as I feel that for the inhabitants of cities, the let's say lawns that are mostly lawns at the moment, those can be transformed to biodiverse open habitat types that actually support those habitats and species that are threatened in their original environment. And once you have the plant richness, you will get insects, butterflies, and that's something for the visual sense of the inhabitants. Once you get insects, you get also birds, and that's for your hearing as well, something. And then you don't need to be a specialist to start feeling and building like personal a relationship with nature, and in that ways I would answer. Thank you.
This is perfect, Ollie. I just want to comment one thing. There's one project from the city of Edinburgh, which is very interesting. I know that the population back in times, I'm talking about 8 or 10 years ago, they were complaining about, oh, but the municipality is not cutting and trimming the lawns. It looks messy and uncontrolled, you know. There was a little bit like this mistrust, and then they did a very, very strong awareness raising campaign about the richness in these biodiversity wildflowers lawns. And today it's really well understood by the citizens of the city that it is better to have a lawn with many, many, many different flowers and insects and butterflies and pollinators than to have a, green desert, if you will. So this changed a lot. The whole understanding of biodiversity within the city of Edinburgh. Yes, I just got a message that Jutta is not yet in. So I would like to pass the word to our next panelist so that we can continue the discussion, to Florian. Florian is the project coordinator of the Green City Accord, and he's also working for Eurocities. And he can tell us a little bit about what the Green City Accord is and what this movement of European mayors is doing.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for the introduction. So my name is Florian. I'm part of the environment team at Eurocities and the project coordinator for the Green City Accord, which is DG Environment's long-term initiative running at least until 2030, which has been launched 2.5 years ago. So the network has been growing to right now 104 cities among 18 member states. And the conception behind the Green City Accord is that each signatory city commits to advance on 5 key environmental issues. So these are clean air, noise, water management, circular waste economy, and biodiversity. When it comes to biodiversity, so far that has been the area where there has been the least legal framework around the actions the cities are supposed to do. So we very much welcome the proposed nature restoration law. And we're happy to see that so each of the areas, such as biodiversity, has 3 indicators where we like to measure progress, which has been done by cities then. And we also cover the percentage of tree canopy cover in the city boundaries, which is similar to the one proposed in the nature restoration law. From the meetings we have with our network, we also know that biodiversity is the most pressing issue among the 5 areas for many of our cities. And within the Green City Accord, we basically we have quite a wide geographical spread among Europe, and we recognize that cities start at a different level. We have cities where there's lots of green areas, and there are cities where there's none or very limited areas. And therefore, we also, within the Green City Accord, we basically offer cities the flexibility to basically establish a baseline scenario, which each city has to submit 2 years after admission. So we're basically in the process right now, and we hope to have the first batch of those baseline reports by the end of the year, and then basically set targets for the upcoming 3 years. And so far, what we've been doing, we are providing technical assistance for each of the areas. We direct the network to the different funding opportunities which have been mentioned before, and we also collected and shared best practices. We have quite some good examples. For example, the Spanish city of Vitoria-Gasteiz has developed quite an extensive plan on renaturation of simply unused land within the city boundaries. And the city of Tallinn, for example, has built this pollinator highway, which I think is also an issue which is quite important when it comes to green roofs. And we will hear a bit more. Yeah.
Thanks so much for this intervention, Florian. I think it's also like quite reassuring to know that 104 cities are committing, to these areas of for the environment, and that I know quite a bit about the Green City Accord, and I know that the indicators they have these 3, let's say, mandatory indicators, but they also are very encouraged to go for more indicators that they feel are important in their context, so that they can choose some alternative ones or additional indicators if they want. And I guess in some years from now, we're going to see this comparison of the baseline and what has been achieved. And I guess this goes very much like a marriage with the nature restoration law and the urban greening plans that Bettina has mentioned, that these cities are already being front runners in a way, because they're already committing, right, to these indicators. The question that I have to you is, I guess the Green City Accord is very much focusing on cities and the urban dimension of the nature restoration law. Let's see, we're seeing the perspective of cities here a lot with this initiative. Do you think that the proposal of the Commission could be improved, or should still be improved, or should be more ambitious, or what is your take from your experience?
I think overall it's great to have this goal of having no net loss by 2030. But then again, coming to our network, and also towards Ollie, we have 6 Finnish cities in the Green City Accord, among them Lahti, and we know that many of our Finnish cities are really, really green. And then, of course, when it comes to development of cities, it's a bit a question about where do we draw the border? Do we take the city limits? Do we take a metropolitan area? And I think we're very much in favor of having a certain level of flexibility. So we would welcome if member states can actually kind of define the goals, and which then could also take into account the existing green spaces in cities that are already there. And on top of that, I mean, the discussion of green roofs and green walls is very important, because we all know there's need for more habitation spaces in a lot of cities, and of course that is a way to mitigate also the loss of potential green space.
Yes, Florian, I guess you touched there in a point, like in cities that are already quite green, as many in Northern Europe. Of course, I guess the questions related to how to deal with the greening related to buildings, related to the construction sector, becomes very relevant. And I guess that these northern cities can show a little bit the way, you know, okay, I'm a green city, I already did kind of my job, but I can do more. How can I, in new settlements or new houses being built, or even in existing buildings, transform the environment in a way that it gets more green? So here is space for a lot of creativity and research, of course, through Horizon Europe, but also for, I would say, entrepreneurship. So I know I'm involved in, I think, 10 or 11 NBS Horizon projects, and we see that many enterprises are bringing this, you know, new, as Jutta, as Bettina also said, new technologies, new new ways to green. That is not only about parks, it's about technology as well. Being smart about sensors, understanding soil, and understanding you know, how water can be intercepted by buildings, and what they can do even for wastewater. We have a project that is really focusing on wastewater via nature-based solutions. So instead of pipes, having NBS, so they are really studying how you can use the facade of a building to clean the wastewater produced by the building. You know, so very, very interesting solutions that are coming up. So yeah, so thank you for this. Yes, and with this, I think Jutta is still not here. Yes, Jutta is here. So Jutta, I would call you to the board. So Jutta Paulus is the shadow rapporteur on the nature restoration law that we're talking a lot about today. And I would like to give her the word for her intervention.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you in the first place for organizing this meeting and this exchange, because I think it's really very important that these issues are discussed, even if the legislation is not ready to be passed, of course, because we're still negotiating in Parliament, Council is still negotiating on their part, and then the trilogues, of course, will be coming up. As to urban ecosystems, I think it is something that cannot be stressed too much, that we really need to look at those ecosystems also, and not only look at the rural areas, because first of all, so many people live in cities. Second, biodiversity cannot be only saved in the countryside, because we know that a lot of insect pollinators, even small mammals, are thriving more in cities than in the countryside nowadays, because there has been a huge transformation in the way we do agriculture as compared to the, let's say, not so much mechanized and chemicized way, which was done until, let's say, the 1950s. So basically, cities play an increasing role also, of course, because cities have been growing a lot over the last 100 years, looking at how much space they take up as compared to not so long ago. I think the Commission has already put forward some good things on green spaces in the cities. We are inclined to add in our approach to the nature restoration law also the blue spaces, which have been a bit overlooked in the Commission's approach. But we know that the blue spaces in cities have not only a role for biodiversity, but also for climate adaptation. They are giving cool places. They can, if restored and designed properly, they can help us mitigate the impact of climate change, because they can take up water in the event of heavy rainfalls. It is proven, the European Environment Agency has great data on that people that are living in the surroundings of green and blue spaces are in much better health, simply by having a favorable environment. And there, I think we should, as legislators, put forward demands to make sure that people have access equally, because usually it is the, let's say, not so rich neighborhoods where less restoration is being done, where less green, less blue is put in the surroundings of people. But on the other hand, those are the people that are usually even more exposed to pollution, more exposed to not so clean air. So I think these are the places where we should act first. As to the things which I heard just in the last few minutes when I was getting online, sorry for being late, but we had several committee meetings with votes where, of course, I had to attend. It is totally right that we have to take a balanced approach. I know about the situation in Finland and other Scandinavian countries where the borders of the municipalities are quite different from the borders in Central Europe, where if you have a city where 90% of the land is forest anyway, it would be a bit difficult to increase the tree canopy cover by another 10%. So I think it would be appropriate to put in some possibilities there for member states to accommodate to the current situation, but we should not decrease the overall targets, and we should make sure that we are really doing targeted approaches. So if you have a city where you have, like I said, 90% forest around the city, it's not such a good idea to put them under the same demands as a city where this is not the case. So, and I also would want to highlight that we should not only look at trees, we should also look at other possibilities to introduce green, to introduce biodiversity in our cities, all the more so, which is something which I know from my former position in Germany, with people renovating their homes due to energy efficiency issues, often small habitats for mammals, for birds get lost, because of course they want to close their roofs. They want to make sure that no more energy is escaping through crevices, is escaping through little holes. But then we have to make sure that we create more habitats for birds and small mammals to nest and to reproduce after doing or while doing the renovation. And there are already great examples on how to work on this. And we should make sure that when building new buildings, new dwellings for people, we should already think of how can we introduce green infrastructure, blue infrastructure at the same time. And usually this is a double effect, of course, enhancing biodiversity, but also it is good for people's well-being, and those houses usually even get a higher price. They have a higher value because people say, hey, it's beautiful here. There are beautiful surroundings. I have some shade in summer. I can sit next to a little pond. My kids can play outside, even if it's not a single family home, but especially all the more so if you have a whole quarter that's being designed, it is of crucial importance importance to already design green and blue infrastructure when building such quarters. There are great examples all over Europe. For example, I visited Copenhagen 2 years ago, where a whole new quarter was planned, and it was actually right already in the planning. How can we make sure that everyone has access to space for recreation, for children to play, but also for nature to be part of our living? In the European Parliament, in the negotiations, we have a quite broad agreement that we should do more on green and blue infrastructure in urban ecosystems. This is not contentious, so I'm looking forward to agreeing on quite ambitious compromises in order to be able to have green and blue infrastructure in all European cities.
This is very, very encouraging, Jutta. Thanks so much for this intervention. A question going a little bit deeper on, because it interests me a lot, what we can do with the new residential areas, or the new business areas, the development areas in cities. I know that the nature restoration law is kind of like, of course, giving this flexibility that the member states and the cities, they should design their own plans, and to be able to see in their own context how that can roll out. But I'm just thinking about some lines. What, in your opinion, could be a way to, to ensure, and here I may be talking even about a bit of the regulatory part of things, that new developers, that they have to follow certain criteria to not forget the biodiversity part, or just not arrive in a place and destroy things that are already there just to put some buildings up.
I think this would be much too detailed to put into a regulation, because a regulation is not to be translated into national law. A regulation is for all European member states. So basically what this regulation is doing, they say we have some criteria which we set forth in the regulation, and the member states in their restoration plans have to show that they will reach those targets. So I would be very careful, because also the national governance is so heterogeneous across Europe. In Germany, we have the federal level, the regional governments, and then the municipalities, and the subsidiarity principle applies in Germany in that way. In other member states, like in France, it's much different, or in Poland, it's even more different. So I think those details should not be put in the regulation, but I think a good idea would be to have the Commission develop guidelines for member states, how to ensure that development is done in a sustainable way. And also, I think the Covenant of Mayors is a wonderful place where mayors who are really in charge of how their cities, how their municipalities develop, could exchange good examples. How could we proceed? In Germany, we have this legal possibility of having a, how do you call it? It's so you always have to apply for an authorization when you want to build something, right? But there is also the possibility to have a contract between the municipality and the developer, regardless of who is at the end of the day the owner of the buildings or whatever is being built. You can have a contract with a developer where the developer has to oblige to certain principles. And if he or she doesn't do so well, the city can say, okay, I'll find someone else who's willing to do it. And this is sometimes even better than having it in the authorization for the building, simply because if you have a contract with both sides have signed, it's very difficult to challenge that in a court ruling, because the court would say, well, why did you sign it in the first place, right? Whereas with an authorization, it's always a bit like, okay, are they overstepping their possibilities in making the developer do something or not? So I think there are examples for that. And I think the important thing is also that citizens themselves approach their municipalities, their mayors, their local representatives saying, we demand a greener city, we demand a more healthy city, We want to have a livable city where everyone can feel well and not some are pushed away to the dirty areas and the other one enjoy a wonderful park. That's not the way we want to proceed. So we have to be active on all areas. And I will surely ask the Commission whether they plan to produce some guidelines on this green and blue infrastructure, because there's so much data we can build on, we can use. The European Environment Agency has also done great work on gathering that data from different European regions and showing how it can all play together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jutta. Yeah, Bettina, I wanted to actually think back to you in case you want to comment on that. And then I would like to read some of the questions. We have very nice questions in the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Not much to add from my perspective, actually. Maybe to mention that in terms of regulation in our member states, we already have excellent examples, because in both France and Germany, if I'm rightly informed, there is already legislation that deals with issues such as soil sealing in cities and so on. So indeed, as Ms. Paulus has just said, this cannot go into a regulation. In the regulation, we can only set the targets, and then anything that from the Commission side we can do to facilitate the implementation, we are of course happy to look into that. As I already mentioned, that we have these guidelines on how to do urban development plans to help cities who wish to do those under the biodiversity strategy to get a head start. By the way, these plans are not obligatory from the nature restoration law side. It is really something that cities will do on their own initiative. I was wondering whether maybe Toni has some good advice on regulatory aspects concerning building green, because I understand he's active in that area. So maybe he's better placed to answer that question also.
Yes. Oh, Toni, I want to actually introduce you before we go to the questions. And you can, because Toni is a specialist on green roofs, and he actually has an intervention here as well. And he can tell us a little bit about the work that they are doing. He's from Sempergreen. Toni, the floor is yours.
Yeah, regarding the regulation, I think is very different in each country, especially here in our country. Yeah, I think that the public awareness is very favorable, but sometimes lacks the means to act. No, that in many countries the application of the green infrastructure construction solutions is not as well implemented as in some Northern European countries. That our experience, therefore, is that the governmental authorities have to take the initiative. No. I think the administration can assume the risk that companies will not take, since the capital is more afraid to risk. Then the administration must apply these measures in order to be able to legislate and to create regulations. I don't know if I have time, but maybe a clear example of the by the administration that ends becoming an example and then allows constructive criteria to be established is the Barcelona Green Roof tender. Over the last 2 years, the City Council has partly funded 10 green roof projects. Now in the city of Barcelona, we already have 20 green roofs of many different types, monitored by the municipality. Yeah, these projects spread throughout the city for the enjoyment of the whole community and of very different types, from extensive green roofs to intensive green roof, real gardens on the roof of some buildings, urban gardens or islands of biodiversity. There are absolutely spectacular natural ecosystems have been created. Then in this way, the city has an extensive catalog of green roofs with all the technical, design and maintenance characteristics. They can serve as a model for future successful projects. This is just one proposal that can be made by the local administration and could be repeated in other cities. I don't know, but I think it's something to start to regulate, and especially here in our countries in the south, that sometimes is not, we are not in the same level as in the Northern European countries.
Toni, this is great. Thank you for raising that example. I think it is really a good example for many countries, and actually even the northern ones, in terms of governance, how you have been doing that. I have a question to you, Toni. How the industry, considering green roof experts and local authorities, can work even more together to achieve these kind of green urban areas. I mean, you mentioned this, that you can put out catalogs, but are there other ways that you have in your profession been sensitized, or some ideas that you have, some positive examples?
I will come back to my city, Barcelona. I'm very proud of my city, and of course, and you know, maybe another idea, because I think it's better to explain with some examples. And another example is also in my city, in Barcelona, is that probably, how can I explain? Probably many of you are familiar with the image of the city, you know, this set of perfectly aligned blocks and squares, the famous Eixample in Barcelona. But when almost 200 years ago, the Catalan engineer Alfonso that designate this grid to deal with the ground of the city, many of these blocks were green. Some were green, and part of the blocks were half building, half garden. Also, the interior of the islands were green. No, Sardà wants to bring the benefits to the countryside to the city. That did not happen, of course. And but in 2020, the Barcelona City Council started the Green Infrastructure and Biodiversity Plan. Then, by creating green corridors, the city council wants to connect these green spaces outside the city. You know, in Barcelona, we have the mountain, the sea, and two rivers in the north and the south. And he wants to connect these green spaces and the green spaces within the city, which at the moment are often isolated spots. Then the metropolitan area of Barcelona bears the potential to create more than 700 kilometers of green corridors, which will link these different areas of the city. They look like a major green arteries, which will help keep Barcelona alive.
Yes, I think you touched upon the very important point also for the nature restoration law, Toni, which is this stitching of the urban with the peri-urban, with the metropolitan areas. So really not thinking about only the city perimeter. And here we have again the examples, as Jutta mentioned, some of the cities in Finland where the understanding of perimeter is a different one. But I guess this, you know, thinking about how these corridors can be connected, connectivity is a very important point for biodiversity, for sure. We don't have much time. Can we just read one session? I'm just hearing here from the organizer. Can we read one question from the Q&A? Yep. Okay, so I have one question. This one goes to the Commission. So the commitment of DG Environment on this agenda is great. It is possible to imagine moving forward a more structured dialogue and interaction among the DGs. So with DG Energy, with DG Regio, DG Research, DG Klima. So can you comment a little bit on that, maybe, Bettina, on this, you know, better interlinkages between the DGs, to the extent of creating an office or a platform where you can have regular dialogue among EU Commission colleagues to advance this agenda in a more holistic way?
Thank you very much. So very happy to give you a little bit of an inside view of our administration. So actually, the biodiversity agenda is extremely cross-cutting. And if you look at the biodiversity strategy itself, there's plenty of actions, and many of them are actually administratively not for DG Environment. So already we work together with most DGs Director Generals in the Commission, for those who maybe not know this jargon. And this cooperation is excellent. We meet regularly. We have a so-called inter-service group where we come together and we discuss hot topics of the day. We also link up with our stakeholders. Some of you may know that we just had a meeting of the EU Biodiversity Platform earlier this week. And of course, in this, also our colleagues from other Director Generals are come and are regular guests, not even guests, but members. And we work together like that. I also wanted to mention again the Global Biodiversity Framework, because this has brought a whole new dimension. Many of those targets on biodiversity, including the urban one that I mentioned in the beginning, require cooperation, of course, then also with all the services inside the Commission and in the other institutions that deal with external policies. So yes, we are a tight-knit community, but we are quite large and happy to enlarge further. Maybe just one more word, because I think this was also a bit implied in this question. The Commission itself as an owner of buildings is also trying to work. So myself, we have moved into new offices, which is actually a refurbished former office close to the Schumann Park and the Saint-Contenaire, it's called. And inside the building, there's green spaces integrated also, and there's even a little gardening initiative where we, the staff, can plant little pots and also little bigger spaces in the back of the building. So I think that the Commission is also trying to live what it preaches. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Bettina. And I would like to put in a last question before we close the session, because I think it's a very important point that we didn't touch that much. I'm not sure to whom ask this question, so I'll leave it to one of the speakers to just raise their hands and then they can jump in. How do you see the role of green spaces in resilience and addressing inequalities leading to justice inequalities? Like, how can we do all the work that we're doing also with the nature restoration law, but addressing injustice issues or access to green? Does anybody want to touch upon that topic? Let me just see if I can see all the speakers. I have a very small screen today. Ollie, do you want to say some words on that, or Florian?
Well, I was trying to search the hand to raise, so I have some idea, but I think especially the urban environments play a crucial role in tackling the injustices, and more than in other environments, I would say. In urban environments, you can choose to locate the measures so that the social injustice inequalities are considered.
Perfect. That's the place for us to discuss this kinds of problems and to solve them, right? Okay. With that, Flo, if you want to say something. Toni, I see your hand. Thank you. Yes, Toni, please come in.
Yes, just let me add something from my point of view. Probably the most important initiative that should be implemented is the dissemination of these projects that we are talking today. Because when we apply these green measures, when we create these corridors, these green corridors that connect the gardens, the parks in our cities, I think it's necessary for the citizens to know what is happening around them. Because only through the knowledge we can improve our perception. What I want to say is, when you know the trees in the street around your house, when you know the birds that live there, when you know the names of these trees, of these birds, then you create an emotional bond with them. Then nature becomes part of your urban ecosystem. And the gardens, the green walls, my activity, the green roof, all these spaces for biodiversity become a common good. It's a social service. It's important for citizens as schools, as hospitals can be. I think it's very important. Sorry.
No, perfect, Toni. I think that's I'm gonna borrow your what you said about the common God and the common good of the green in the city. So thank you for bringing that. I have unfortunately to close the session, but I would like to thank you very much for the panelists and for discussing today this very important topic that we really wish that the nature restoration laws flies and bring all the cities, and that we have a much greener Europe, and thinking about the global biodiversity framework, that we can show that European member states are really willing to do the best they can to achieve the targets. Thank you.